Thank you very much, Jude Howell. I think you have raised many very, very central points and questions. I think what we shall do is we shall have just a little conversation here. Especially, I would be interested to see how Roland Robertson maybe would like to comment on some of the points you have brought up, because I think they are extremely relevant for what we understand. What is a glocality, and how is the glocality theme being influenced by the change in, if you like, power structures? And maybe I think one point which I would like just to emphasize on here, because the charity movement, as we know it in the UK, also in other countries, is of course, as you said, it's a very major part of UK culture. It's a tradition which has been carried on which I don't think we have to the same extent in a German setting. So I just would like to make a comment on that, because I think it is difficult otherwise maybe to understand what this whole question of the independence of charity movements, of calling their cause into question within the more broader cultural context of UK, maybe also the US, where also I think we have the reliability of many societal developments on charities, on the voluntary work, is different to a setting where we have that to a lesser extent. We have it, of course, also. So maybe you would like just to catch up on a couple of these comments before we then will involve the public. Here you are. Roland.
Me?
Yes. Would you like to comment? First of all, maybe just ask you, but then you two have a conversation without me always trying to ask you questions. But I think maybe you would like to comment on some of these points which...
Well, I'd like to make some connection between the idea of globalization on the one hand, and civil society on the other. The question can be put perhaps a little too bluntly: where did the modern idea of civil society come from? As far as I can see, it came into great prominence at the end of the 1980s, particularly following the fall of the Berlin Wall. So in that sense, civil society is interpreted in particular ways in particular societies. And to put it very crudely, civil society is basically a global idea. So we're interested in how the global idea of civil society is locally implemented. So I found it a little bit difficult, I'm sorry to put it so bluntly, I find it a little bit difficult to see where Jude is actually coming from. What does she want? Why does she want it? What judgment is she using? What criteria? What values? I agree with her, incidentally, but that's not the point.
Okay, what I'm interested in the politics of civil society, the idea of civil society, and how this idea is used. So I didn't have time to go into it, but part of trying to sketch out the background to this is to I would have said, for example, that the idea of civil society has been resurrected with the end of the Cold War, partly because of the resurrection of the idea in Eastern Europe by intellectuals like Howell and others. And this idea has then trickled into the discourse of political leaders as part of their promotion of the ideas of democratization and good governance. So I've been interested in following how the idea of civil society has begun to enter into international development discourse and then turn into programs and practical projects and so on. And looking at the particular idea of civil society that is being promoted through international development institutions, which is primarily, or the one that has come to be, the vision that has come to be particularly dominant is a neo-Tocquevillian idea of civil society that has become very popular in the United States and lies behind many of the civil society developing programs, and one that celebrates plurality and harmony rather than seeing civil society as a site of contestation. Now, what I would argue with the launch of the War on Terror after 2001 is that the experience of working with civil society, and for many different reasons, civil society, the idea of civil society and the practice of civil society comes into doubt for practical reasons and also for political reasons. And so there's this new strategic envisioning of how to use the idea of civil society from that period onwards.
Would you like to enlarge on that?
Well, I'm really playing the role of devil's advocate, because really, Jude and I probably agree about what the ideal civil society would be like. Nevertheless, in the role of devil's advocate, I would ask, hasn't each group, hasn't each society its own right to have its own form of civil society? I mean, why should we dump, as it were, our ideas of civil society onto the Chinese or the South Africans or whatever? I wish that we could, actually, but that's not quite the point. Or just a little further aside is one of the best examples of a euphemistic use of the term civil society is in terms of the big society. We could probably agree with that.
Yes, well, I think that is an important normative question, and I guess what I'm interested in is in looking at how actually this process of trying to impose a certain vision on civil society and what kind of vision actually is occurring. And there's another question about whether that's normatively valid or not. And I think it's what is interesting to see, for example, in the case of China, is that you see a resistance to actually using the term civil society in Chinese is contested, and there's a lot of discussion about what term we should actually use for many reasons, because non-governmental organization, for example, can easily be translated or understood by the government as being anti-government organization. So I think China is a good example where people and scholars as well are looking to find other ways of talking about similar phenomenon of being able to independently associate and to carve out spaces for where citizens can independently organize, which may also lead to criticism of the government as well. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, maybe I can also be a devil's advocate. Yes. And ask the question the other way around to both of you. We have in the one case, I'm sure, the effects of the culture of suspicion, the culture of fear. And on the other hand, we have non-governmental groups who themselves use the concept of caring, the concept of mitigating between society and whatever, to radicalize, to have their own option. Especially, I think, in many of the international terrorist groups, we see this kind of thing. If it's Hezbollah or very many other groups. So, what is the effect at the local, if we look at the UK, and we have, just as an example, and we have migrant groups living in a kind of a diaspora, how is this kind of sort of tying up the very local or national suspicion which is put on local groups, and the way there is, we can, I think, see radicalization and use of the idea of civil society to put through very questions which are certainly not liberal in the sense of freedom.
Yes, well, I think this is very clearly shown in the case of the degree of suspicion that has intensified after 9/11 towards to Muslim communities in Europe and in the US. It's of interest, I think, that in the US it is only Islamic charities. It is the list of prohibited charities only includes Islamic charities in the US, and other charities have not come under suspicion in the same way. And what I found particularly interesting in the research is looking at the responses of this civil society to this growing suspicion of Muslim communities. Because initially you saw it was only the human rights groups and some Muslim community leaders and groups that were challenging this, these attitudes of suspicion towards Muslim communities. And other parts of civil society, like your voluntary sector in the UK, or many of the non-profits in the US, actually did not come in and try to defend Muslim communities against this suspicion. So I think what that showed was an idea about civil society that is actually a bit exclusive, that doesn't include certain groups within it. And it was only when non-profit organizations, through the voluntary guidelines that were issued by the Treasury in the US or in the UK by the forthcoming report of the Treasury and the Home Office about charities and terrorism were being drafted, that you could say the mainstream voluntary sector began to look at what was the effects of new counter-terrorist regulations on civil society organizations and began to notice what had been happening with Muslim communities. So I think that threw into question in a way, how much voluntary sector organizations had an idea about civil society that went beyond service delivery, and that was about the emancipation, that was about participation of citizens in governance processes and so on.
So this may be one of the real dilemmas?
Certainly is. I mean, this may not be directly to the point, but since I left England a couple of days ago, there has arisen this case which Jude will know more about than I, the case of City University, where City University is demanding the right, in fact, to send, well, they call it, the Muslims call it censor, to inspect the sermons which are going to be delivered in the mosque before they are actually delivered. Now, here is a true dilemma. Do people deny, I asked Jude, whether it's possible, perhaps it's already happened, that people preach in mosques that London should be blown up? Do they or don't they? Is it possible? And if it is possible, should we censor it? I don't necessarily think we should, but it's a real problem.
Yes, there is a real problem, and that's why you need a civil society as an
Can use otherwise
that is why you need a spaces where people can organize independently. You need guarantees of freedom of association, assembly and speech so that people can discuss these issues. And it's when you have restrictions coming down on civil society for whatever reasons that some citizen groups will start becoming afraid of speaking out against government. And I think you saw that in the immediate years after the launch of the War on Terror, when Muslim charities were coming under Islamic charities were coming under suspicion. It was primarily Islamic charities in the US that were put on the one of the banning lists. But actually the non-profit sector remained quiet. Why? Because they didn't want to be seen in the States as being unpatriotic. And that phenomena actually illustrates the fragility of civil society in some ways. And civil society is about having those spaces and the right of people to organize, to debate these kind of dilemmas, to find out how we want to go, what are the limits of freedom of speech.
Maybe a last question, and then we shall go into to the public. How do you see the role of media in this kind of question? I mean, bad news is good news for media because it sells newspapers and television programs and so on. What can we do to be have a more differentiated picture in the media? Because at the moment we seem to really be polarizing between those who indeed will react, becoming themselves maybe more radical in their views. I think we can see this. Certainly we'll be talking about this afternoon, and we can see this also in Germany. And maybe the others who don't speak up. So what can we do also to encourage within groups, it doesn't matter which ethnic or religious or which sector of civil society, how do we encourage and enable speaking up, even if it is seemed to be against one's own ethnic or whatever neighborhood group?
Well,
can the media play a role there?
Well, it depends what you mean by media, but let me confine myself for the moment to newspapers, which are of declining significance, I think, but nonetheless they are important. I read an article in the Financial Times of London about a week ago, which was mainly about the late Stan Cohen, who of course is well known to most of us, famous for a particular phrase, namely the phrase moral panic. And so this writer, I forget his name, he was a friend of Stan Cohen's, I was a friend too. He actually said that the Daily Mail, one of the worst, horrible, right-wing tabloids in Britain, in my view, it specializes in moral panics. It has a moral panic on its front and sometimes on many of its inside pages every single day of the week, or every single day when it's published. Now, what do we do about that? Do we do anything? Do we try to stop them? Do we have a more balanced kind of press? It's a real problem.
Yes, I think one interesting development here that shouldn't be overlooked is the rapid development of the internet as part of the process of globalization. And that, I think, has in many countries created possibilities for citizens to express their views more freely in different ways, and for them also to express their concerns about government policy, and also to organize. So I think that's a very important technological development that opens up a new possibilities for citizen association expression.
Is it also two-sided, that we then suddenly, of course, have views?
Yes, yes. I mean, it also raises problems around what is tolerable, what is going to be allowed to be put on internets, what kind of things can be said or not be said, what's acceptable, and those are issues that have to be debated, and that is why you need civil society as an independent sphere where people can assemble and speak up.
What would civil society do to prevent horror stories being told all over the internet?
Well, civil society provides a space where people can express and argue. It's that democratic debate that you can have on the internet as well. I mean, freedom of speech is always going to have that edge of where nasty things can be said about people, as well as wonderful ideas can be debated. And that's the whole point of it.
Okay. Thank you.